To a fish, water is invisible. Hello, everyone. My name's John Fernal. I'm a retired high school teacher, photographer, writer, and as of today, video maker. You may know me by my alter ego, my photography business is called Good Noise. My plan for a while has been to create a number of videos on a variety of topics. Today, I'm finally starting, about a year late. I think I was hoping to do this last February. As much of my teaching career and life has been made up of thinking about and teaching how media affects us, I've decided to start these videos with where my teaching ended, something called Media Mondays. This was every Monday in my class. What I decided I'd do was that I'd turn the class over to my students. They could, talk about anything and bring up things that they watched or thought about that were related to what we had done the previous week. And the deal was, of course, that as long as they could keep the conversation going, they could have the class. And often we did, 75 minutes later, we were still talking. And it became very popular and very successful, which is how I want to kind of shape these videos. I want to start just with talking a little bit, giving some ideas, and then hopefully getting some feedback from you. Questions, comments, points that you'd like to make, whatever it is. So please, if you have things to add or questions to ask, please do so. As you can see, I've decided to make the videos as raw as possible to begin, mainly because one of the things I'll talk about in the future is that all media are versions of reality. There is really no such thing as real in the media. So I'm going to try and stay as close to as real as I can get, and that's mainly by not editing. I'll make a few mistakes here or there, I'm sure, as I do. I'm not going to add any music, credits, or anything like that. It's just kind of this one take, natural lighting. As you can see, it's been snowing here and it's quite cold outside, but it is quite beautiful. There are, I guess one of the things I should explain is why am I doing this? And there are good media literacy resources out there. Not as many as perhaps there should be, seeing as media is such a big part of our lives, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But what happens, or what tends to happen, is that those resources, the good ideas, become sponsored, right? And as soon as something becomes sponsored, it changes. There's a good example. I'm not going to remember the original name of it, but when I first started this, there was a great media website, and it was free. It wasn't sponsored at all. And then at some point along the way, it became what's the Media Awareness Network, which is a Canadian resource. And again, they have lots of good stuff there, but the problem I have is that it's sponsored. It's sponsored by YouTube, and it's sponsored by, CTV and a few other places, Bell Media probably. And that changes things. Once there's sponsors involved, that the network has to answer to those sponsors. And so I want to avoid that as much as possible. Some of the other problems I have with the videos is they give lots of information, but they don't really explain how the media affects us personally, which really over time in the course became my focus, right? The idea behind it slowly morphed into this, if you could learn these ideas, then you could have more control over your media intake and how the media affects you. And of course, one of the problems with using media to teach about the media is that when it starts to generate money or when it becomes successful, it often follows that path, right? It's shaped by its success in some ways, which means it doesn't always stay focused on the original intent. The Media Awareness Network that I mentioned above, I think, is a good example of that. And so you might be asking yourself, well, why do this then? Why create these videos? Well, it's kind of the same way I feel about education. And I'm sure, if it interests you, if people have questions, I'm happy to talk about my experience with education. I did retire a couple of years early. I should be teaching now, retiring April Fool's Day this year, but I decided to go 2 years early, mainly because I had had enough. But my practice all the way through teaching was that you can subvert the system. In fact, my favorite book, if there are teachers who are watching this and are looking for something to read, Neil Postman, my favorite book of his is Teaching as a Subversive Activity, and I learned lots of really good things from that. The other thing that I want to focus on is the whole idea of self-awareness, right? Of living an examined life. That part of that has to involve the media. It plays such a huge part in our lives It makes us who we are. And so if we want to understand better why we do the things we do, why we think the things we do, then part of that has to be media literacy. And some people might, I'm scared to use these words, might use, say I'm trying to wake you up, or I'm trying to, make you woke. Of course, I want to avoid both of those terms because unfortunately they've been changed. I prefer the word aware, right? And partly I prefer it because awake and woke kind of suggests that, once you're there, you're there. And aware to me is a more active thing, that if you're always aware of these things, or if you remind yourself at least to be aware of it, then a lot of the power of that thing goes away. I think the advantage I have over others in teaching this stuff is that I came to most of what I taught naturally. I don't know if that makes sense or not. I wasn't a great student in university. I wasn't even really a great student in high school, although I enjoyed my time. But a lot of these things just kind of happen naturally, even coming into English media. And I'll explain that in a second. And of course, as I got older, as often happens, you start thinking about who you are and how you were shaped. I came to the conclusion that I know I have been hugely shaped by the media, right? I grew up with TV, right? As TV was coming a thing, I remember I lived in Regina, Saskatchewan, and, watching The Lone Ranger on one of the 3 channels I think we got at the time. I remember watching The Love Boat and Fantasy Island with my parents on a Saturday night. Star Wars. Star Wars was a huge thing to me. This was early days. I think I saw the original one eight or 9 times in the theater. Probably the same with The Empire Strikes Back and The Return of the Jedi. My father was an early adopter when it came to technology. We had VCRs long before other people did, and cameras. We had VHS cameras as well. So all of that stuff allowed me a chance to kind of mess around with the media as well. I liked video games. Kind of with the first round of video games. Some of you may remember a thing called Bally or ColecoVision, Atari, which I didn't have, but I had friends who had them. That was a part of my life as well. And even growing up, I would make these videos. You have to remember this is such a different process. I was into basketball in high school, and I used to make these things that I called dunk tapes, and where I would tape games on a VHS tape. And as I watched them, I'd kind of make note of on the counter, which wasn't minutes and hours or seconds necessarily. I'd make note of where the dunks were, and then I'd go back and push play on one while I pushed record on the other, and then I'd pause it, and I'd find the next one, and I'd continue that way until I had 3 or 4 minutes of content. And then I'd dub over a song that I liked, right? Probably something like Van Halen or Def Leppard or something that I used to listen to when I was in high school. It was a huge process. It took a long time, but I loved it. I really enjoyed it. And but I never really thought that I would do anything with it. It was just kind of for fun. Eventually, I'd become the very popular guy in my English department because I could always get the VCRs working and whatever else, but that's a different story. The first time in an institution that I kind of started thinking about media was my 4th year at UWO, where I took a film course, one of the few courses that I really enjoyed in my university time. That got me thinking a little more about film. But what really did it, I think, was the first little, put something in my mind was I had to choose electives while I was I went to Teachers College in Scotland. Again, I can talk about that in the future, why I went there. I didn't have the marks to get in here, that's for sure. And I had to choose some electives, and one of them was a media literacy elective. And so I chose it, and again, really enjoyed it. Got me thinking a lot about my own relationship to the media. And then finally, when I came back and I went, okay, first little technical glitch is that my recording software stopped at about 9 minutes. So even though I said it was going to be 1 take, apparently it's not, but I'm going to carry on and see how much further I can get. So as I was saying, after I returned from Scotland, I had a friend who kind of pushed me into teaching these new English media courses. They were being offered in grade 11 and 12, both at the advanced and general level, and I jumped on it, and I'm very thankful that I did. So, why am I doing this now? I did my, 25 years of teaching the course. Well, sadly, it feels to me like media kind of peaked maybe in the 2000s. Media literacy peaked in the 2000s. We were very interested in it. And now a lot of people have forgotten about it. And I'm not sure if it's because people think they're media literate and so we don't need this training anymore, but I don't see it. In fact, my experience was that over the last 10 years, it's actually gone downhill. We have, even though we say we're teaching more media literacy, in many ways we're not. What's happened is that, at one point along the way, if you remember the Mike Harris government, they actually rewrote the curriculum and eliminated the media literacy courses, took them right out. And they were only brought back because at the time, media literacy teachers made a lot of noise and said, this is really important. So they brought back one of the 4 courses, which wasn't the same, of course. And then they said, oh, well, don't worry. We're going to put it into all of our English core courses. So up to 25% of all of the English courses in high school will focus on media literacy. Well, again, the reality is, and I know this from talking to my colleagues, most English teachers are not prepared to teach it. They just haven't been taught themselves, and so therefore they just ignore it. Or, they say, oh, well, I showed the film version of a book, therefore that's media literacy. Not really. There's nothing wrong with that. That's, it's good to see different versions of things, but, unless you're actually going to talk about how a meaning is created in that thing, then I'm not sure it's the same thing. There's lots of creation going on. That happened in our course. When I first started teaching it, the first half was theory and the second half was practical stuff, but then the funding got cut, cameras stopped working, there was no way to replace them, and then eventually it became media arts. So everybody who wanted to create went to media arts, and my course became a theory course, which was okay by me. Again, I made it work, but it changed things. So we have a lot of let's make a commercial and stuff like that, and again, I'm not making fun of that. I think that's important, but it's not necessarily teaching people to be media literate. Sadly, when I retired 2 years ago, the course actually went with me. Nobody else wanted to teach it. They just took it out of the offerings because it was an elective, and it's still no longer being taught. Even the last 2 or 3 years, I had to fight for it to stay. There was seemed to be a concerted effort to try to get rid of it. And I have theories as to why that is. Do people want to know how they are manipulating you? Our government, our education system, a lot of these institutions rely on the media to get messages across. Do they really want people to know that the tools and tricks, if you want to call it that they're using? I'm not sure. It seems to me like perhaps they don't. And certainly, there's a big tie with corporations, and do corporations want to know how they are want us to know how they're manipulating us? I don't think so. Which brings me back to where I started, right? To a fish, water is invisible, which is exactly how I start at my course every year. And really the idea is that, we are so surrounded by the media that we don't even think about it much anymore. It's just part of our day-to-day life. And so a lot of those, a lot of the things that we need to understand, that are important to understand, just get ignored. It's just there. It's just the way it is, right? People say. And I'd like to see that changed. I think that, again, there's been lots of talk about freedom and power and all these other things. And I'm a firm believer that if you want, to be free, you need to understand how you're being manipulated. So, that's one of the reasons it's important to be media literate. There are others, I used to always start the course by saying this is the most important course you will ever take. I know it sounds really egotistical, but I believe it. It applies to everything that we do. And we have to, in order to begin, we have to at least acknowledge the role that media plays in our own life. And that's often where I would start, right? Start really by talking about what a medium is, which is just kind of a connector between two things, right? Some way that we deliver information. There's always some confusion, right? Because when you talk about the idea of media, I think most people think we're talking about what they would call today the mainstream media or the legacy media. But these concepts that I'm going to teach you over the next 8 weeks, they apply to all media, right? So whether it's somebody making a YouTube video or even someone sending an email or whatever it is a billboard, television show, movie, newspaper, I don't care. These things apply to all of them, right? And don't let the use of media and medium confuse you. It used to always confuse my students because, sometimes we talk about the media is or the media are. Media can both be a singular and a plural noun. It's kind of confusing, I know, but when we talk about the media, we're often talking about the whole spectrum of everything, right? One of the reasons I think that people think it has no effect, is that why it works so well is because most people think it doesn't affect them. There's a great line from Jean Kilbourne in one of the videos I used to show in which she talks about, young boys coming up to her and saying, oh, well, this stuff has no effect on me. And meanwhile, they're wearing, their Budweiser hats and their Roots sweatshirts, right? They've lost that connection of understanding how they're being manipulated into, sporting those brands. And again, of course, there's the argument that if you don't think something is having an effect on you, you let your guard down. All those, normally we're very critical, we're thinking critically about things, but if we don't believe it affects us, then we just let that down. One of my favorite things to start with too was Plato's allegory of the cave, and I'll try to explain it very quickly, but basically it's this idea that, Plato said that imagine there's a prisoner in a cave, and he has his neck chained and his arms chained, and he's forced to look at the back wall, and behind him on a parapet there's a fire and some people with cutouts, right, and they're walking along in front of it, and what's happening is the shadows are being cast in front of the people, and of course because that's all those people have ever seen, they think that that's reality. These things, that those shadows that they were seeing, are reality. And of course, in the allegory, Plato says, now imagine one of these guys somehow gets free, right, gets the chains off him, and he turns around, and of course he's going to be blinded by the fire, but once his eyes adjust, he's going like, oh, well, this is weird. And then if he starts moving towards kind of the light at the opening of the cave, again, it's going to be hard to see. But once he finally gets out there, he's going to realize, oh, this is reality, right? And again, I think that's a really good allegory for media, right? Media does the exact same thing. Media really is the shadows, right? And so in some ways, I guess I'm going to try to be the guy who has taken the shackles off, and I'm going to try to convince you. And part of the allegory, of course, is that when he returns to tell his friends aren't very happy. They don't believe him. They think he's crazy. They're just like, get out of here. And again, that, makes sense. We're like I said, we're so inundated. We are those fish that we don't really think about it much. So we don't think it has much effect, but it does. So in my course, I would normally start by, spending the first couple of weeks just getting the kids to think about, well, what is your relationship with the media? Even back in 1990, 1989, the book that I'll show you next time that I get the concepts from, had a stat that by the time you graduate high school, you will have watched 11,000 hours of TV, film, whatever. You will have I screwed that up. You will have spent 11,000 hours in school, and you will have spent 17,000 hours watching TV. That's in 1989, right? This is pre-cell phone, pre-internet. There's no doubt that today that is much, much higher. So I would just get them to think about, look at your phone. If you can find where your phone tells you how much time you spend a day on it, see how much it is. How much time do you spend watching TV? How much time do you spend on video games? Add it all up, and then we'd sometimes do this little math thing where we'd say, okay, well, if on average we live to be 78 years old, how many years of your life will you spend with the media? And it was shocking. Some kids would be upwards of 50 years of their life, 60 years. And this is, you're still talking about sleeping, some of the time sleeping. And even then I would learn, when cell phones came along, kids would tell me, oh yeah, they sleep with their cell phone under their pillow because they want to, if something happens, they want to know. It's just a very different world when it comes to our connection to the media now. And so we would do that. We would talk a little bit about this idea of mind share, right, which is the idea of what is in your head. The reality is that advertisers, corporations, marketers, they want to get a piece of our mind. They want to normalize their products. That's what they do. And so, I'd do this little experiment where I'd show them pictures of leaves from trees and ask them how many they can identify. And, I think out of 15, the top person that they could get was 3. And then I would show them an alphabet made up of the first letter of product names, right? Just the first letter. It comes from a museum. And, sometimes kids, and this was an old one too, it was, 10 or 15 years old, and they could still identify sometimes 15 or 17 of those logos. It was quite astounding. And again, simply the first letters, right? So that's the idea of mind share. We would talk a little bit about conscious and subconscious thought. And how the subconscious really does have an impact on who we are. I won't get into that right now. We had a couple fun experiments with subliminal advertising, which again is, debatable whether or not it works, but it was kind of fun to do. I get them to write down, just sit for 10 minutes and write down any thoughts that entered their head. And then once they've written those things down, I'd ask them to go through and figure out, okay, well, where did they come from, right? And again, a lot of them would discover that a lot of the ideas that were in their head came from the media. So that was kind of how I started, and just to try to again get them to understand. Perhaps your relationship with the media goes a little deeper than you think, right? And I think most of us, when we're challenged on that, would agree. I know I get people who say to me, "Wow, I don't have TV in my house, and I don't do this, and I don't do that." But the reality is, whether or not you have TV and advertisers can get to you that way or not, they're still getting to you, right? They're getting to you through the behavior of others, through what people choose to wear, through what they talk about, all of that stuff. So, it's pretty naive to think that you can not be manipulated, or sorry, maybe manipulated. It's a little strong there. You at least, you're not being affected by the media. And actually, by the time the course was over, I usually had at least one or two students come up to me and say, "Oh, Mr. Fernal, I hate this course." And I'd be like, "What? Why do you hate it?" And like, "Well, I can't watch TV now or films without counting edits or seeing this or seeing that." And I would say to them, just relax about it. Give it time, because my experience was that eventually, if you understand the media, you can enjoy it for what it is, but you can also appreciate the art in it, right? And the art of the manipulation, the all of that stuff. So that's kind of how I am with media. I still consume a lot of media. I watch some crappy reality TV, but I can appreciate again how skillfully they are manipulating me, how they're making me feel like, oh, that's a bad person, that's a good person, I should cheer for this person and whatever. So I think that that's true as well, that you can enjoy media on a lot of different levels. And so what I'm going to try to do is, over the next 8 weeks, each Monday, I'm going to present, there are 8 concepts that I taught over time. I kind of learned them, and yes, there are different lists now. I think the 8 has become 7 or 6, and depending on where you get the list, some have 5. I'm going to stick with the ones I know, partly because they changed as I taught them, as I learned them, and as I applied them to new media. I learned a lot as well, and that was probably why I think this is important, right? Is that I've come to understand how this affects me. I've come to understand how this affects our children. I've come to understand how this affects a lot of adults. But the problem I'm finding now is that when I try to have these conversations, most people, think they're media literate, but they only apply it to the media that they disagree with. So a lot of people I'll get in conversations with, and they'll say, "Well, that's the mainstream media." And I'll say, "Well, where are you getting your information?" And they'll tell me, "Oh, from a YouTube person." I say, "Well, that's media as well, right?" So we have to use the same things we apply to the mainstream media, we have to apply to our favorite media too. And that's really difficult for some people. So yeah, that's about it. What I'd ask you to do, well, as I said earlier, I'd love you to follow what I'm doing here. If this sounds interesting, I hope to make the next videos much shorter. My goal is to keep them under 10 minutes. If you have questions or comments, feel free to write them down below, and I will try to answer them. It might also give me, kind of a direction to go. If you want homework, everybody loves homework. I would challenge you to do 2 things. Well, maybe one thing for sure. The biggest thing is, put a number to the hours that you are connected to the media. Just try to figure it out. Even if it's as simple as looking at your phone and seeing what it tells you, how many hours you spend on your phone. But just to get a sense of, well, how many hours a day or a week or a year do I spend with the media? And if you want some other homework, or something maybe that you've never seen before, watch something like The Matrix. If you haven't watched it, it's really, to me, a metaphor about the media as well. And The Truman Show is another good one too. One of my favorite lines comes from The Truman Show. And in it, I'm not going to remember his name right now, but the guy who's controlling everything says, "We accept the reality of the world with which we're presented." It's as simple as that. And I think that's what's happening right now, is that, we accept this without putting much critical thought to it. And I hope to change that. Hope to see you next week. Bye.